Hello friends, today's topic is germination of pollen grains. The pollen grains that germinate only if it falls on the stigma of the same plant species, otherwise it degenerates. The pollen grains only germinate if it falls on the same stigma, which means stigma of the same plant species, otherwise the pollen grains degenerates. And the pollen grains on reaching to the stigma absorb nutrients that is secreted by the stigma, and the pollen tube begins to grow. On the arrival of these pollen grains on the stigma, the pollen grains start to absorb the nutrients that is secreted by the stigma, and the pollen tube begins to grow. The tube nucleus remains close to the growing tip of the pollen tube and eventually disintegrate. So, the pollen tube nucleus that is present towards the tip of the pollen. Meanwhile, the generative nucleus divide into two male gametes or nuclei which move to the tip of the tube and lie in the mass of cytoplasm. The generative nucleus that is present in the pollen grains that divide it into two male gametes or nuclei, and these male gametes move to the tip of the pollen tube and it lies in the mass of cytoplasm. The tube then turns towards the micropyle, passes inwards through it, and finally reaches the embryo sac close to the egg cell. And this pollen tube then enters through the micropyle and passes inwards and finally reaches the embryo sac, which is present and then close to the egg cell. So this pollen tube enters through the micropyle, passes inwards, finally reaches the embryo sac and finally reaches to the egg cell. After pollen tube penetrates into the embryo sac, the tip of the tube dissolves and the male gametes are set free inside the ovule. After the entry of this pollen tube, it penetrates into the embryo sac. The pollen tube penetrates into the embryo sac and the tip of that pollen tube dissolves, and the male gamete that is present inside that pollen tube are set to deliver inside the ovule. One male gamete fuses with the egg cell and forms the fertilized egg or zygote, and the other male gamete, the second male gamete that is present in the pollen tube, it fuses with the secondary nucleus, that is the nucleus formed by the fusion of polar nuclei, and it forms the endosperm nucleus. So one male gamete fuses with the egg cell to form the zygote, and the other male gamete fuses with the secondary nucleus, that is the nucleus which is formed by the fusion of polar nuclei which is present in the central cell, and form the endosperm nucleus. The fusion of male gametes with these two polar nuclei is often referred as triple fusion. So the fusion of this male gamete with the polar nuclei with the two polar nuclei is termed as triple fusion. The zygote develops into the embryo while the endosperm nucleus develops into the endosperm of the seed. So the zygote later develops to embryo, and the endosperm nucleus develops into the endosperm of the seed. So we can conclude this topic. So the pollen grain arrives on the stigma of the plant. The pollen grains germinate only if it arrives on the stigma of the same plant species. On the arrival of these pollen grains on the stigma, they start to absorb the nutrients that is present on the stigma. After absorbing the nutrients, the pollen grains start to develop pollen tube, and this pollen tube, it contains a pollen tube nucleus. Later it degenerates. As the pollen tube starts to grow, it enters into the micropylar end and reaches the embryo sac and then the egg cell. On that time, the generative nucleus start to divide and produce two male gametes. One of the male gamete fuses with the polar nuclei which is present on the central cell, and one male gamete fuses with the egg cell and to form zygote. The one male gamete that fused with the polar nuclei forms the endospermic cell, and this fusion is termed as triple fusion, which means one male gamete fuses with two polar nuclei which is present on the central cell. So this fusion is termed as triple fusion. And then the zygote develops to embryo and the primary endosperm cell develops to endosperm.